In this video, we're going to take a look at enforcing the primary key constraint on a table in Oracle. The whole idea behind a primary key constraint is that I want to have some value that's not shared by any two records, a unique identifier for all the records in the table. And in this example, we'll be looking at some information that might be used to support a small family counseling practice. So we'll keep track of a set of counselors and the certifications that those counselors have when they got their degrees and any industry certifications that they might have. So let's take a look at creating a table. So here we'll just go ahead and create a counselor table. We have counselor ID, which I'll intend to be my unique identifier. So no two records should have the same value for the counselor ID. First name, last name, and a phone number. And we'll execute that. Now let's go ahead and insert a few records into that table. And let's take a look at the data that we have. So we've got 3 counselors. We've got records for the phone number for 2 of them. You'll notice that when we inserted the information for Daryl Cooper, used the keyword null to indicate that we did not have the telephone number. So that indicates there's no value for that. So when I'm working with a primary key, and I want this to be my unique identifier, this counselor ID, there are 2 conditions that I want to make sure never happen. One, I want to make sure that I never get a null value, a blank value in that. I want to have a counselor ID for every one of my counselors. And the second one, I want to make sure that no 2 counselors have the same counselor ID. So in the way that we've created this table so far, there's no constraint that prevents either of those 2 things from happening. And so let's go ahead and insert some data that would cause those problems. So here we're going to insert another counselor, Leslie Wright, or Leslie Rice. In this video, we're going to examine how to enforce the primary key constraint. The whole idea behind a primary key is that I want to have a column or set of columns in a table for which no 2 records have the same values. That way I can use those values to uniquely identify those records. In this example, we'll be looking at information for a small family counseling practice. We'll be keeping track of information about the counselors themselves. So in this case, we'll need to make sure that we have some way to distinguish the counselors inside the database. So let's go ahead and create a table to keep information about these counselors. So it's a pretty straightforward table. We've got the unique identifier that we'll be using, the counselor ID, first name, a last name, and a telephone number. Of course, if we were really managing this system, we'd probably have a lot more information, but for this example, we'll keep it simple. So we'll create that table, and let's go ahead and insert a few records into this table. And take a look at those records. So we've got 3 counselors, Quinn, Elizabeth, and Daryl, counselor ID number 10, 11, and 12. So in this case, when I say, hey, let's refer to counselor number 11, we know exactly which one there is. There's only one counselor 11. You'll also notice here that we've entered the record for Daryl without a telephone number. And the way we specified that was by specifying the keyword null in the insert statement. So we're saying there is no value for that. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at adding now another record that might cause a problem. So here we're going to enter another record for another counselor, Leslie Wright. And for the counselor ID, we're not going to supply a value. We're going to indicate null, saying there's no value for this. Now this is a condition we would like to avoid because we would like each one of our counselors to have a counselor ID, because that's the way we're going to refer to that counselor inside the database. Right now, as the table is unconstrained, that record is allowed to be entered with no value for that counselor ID. Let's take a look at another one. Here, I'm going to insert another counselor, Abigail Smith, and I'm going to specify counselor ID number 12. Well, the problem is I've already got a counselor ID 12. And again, because this table is unconstrained, that record's going to go in just fine. So we can take a look at those records, and we'll see that we do have a counselor here with no ID, and we've got 2 counselors that share the same ID. And so that's the very problem that we're going to try to avoid by enforcing the primary key constraint. So let's drop this table and start again. Let's take another look at creating that counselor table. Now, when I get right here to creating the counselor ID, I want to constrain it. I want to say this is my primary key. And so I'll do that by adding the keyword primary key. I'll then go ahead and create the rest of the table just as I did before. And now Oracle is going to enforce the primary key constraint and prevent these two problems from happening. It will not allow null values to come into the primary key, and it will not allow duplicate values to come in. Let's take a look. We're entering in a few of those same first three records. We're back to where we started. And now let's try to add in Leslie's record again with no value for the primary key. Now when we execute that line, Oracle prevents the insert from happening, has an error, tells me can't insert null into that counselor table, the counselor ID. Same thing if we try to put a duplicate. So we already have a counselor number 12. We're going to try to add another counselor with that same ID. Oracle will reject this one as well, indicating that there's a unique constraint that's been violated. And so we can see that those records did not get entered. But if we correct them, if we give Leslie a number, number 13, she goes in just fine. And if we give Abigail a number, number 14, one that doesn't conflict with an existing number, she goes in fine. And we can take a look at those and see that those records came in. And so by specifying the primary key constraint, Oracle is going to make sure that every one of my records has a unique value in that primary key. Now that's pretty simple when the primary key is a single column. But what if the primary key has more than one column? Let's take a look at this table. So this will be our certification table, a table that we use to keep track of which certifications our counselors hold. So I'm going to bring in this information, identify this information by specifying the counselor ID. So if I'm going to talk about Quinn's certifications, I'll say, well, this is a certification for counselor ID number 10, and this is his first certification. So we'll have the cert number will be 1, 2, 3. For each counselor, we'll start again with 1. And so in this case, since I want to be able to record two different certifications for Quinn, then the counselor ID cannot be the primary key. Likewise, since the cert number 1, everyone will have the same value for their first certification. That can't be the primary key either. But taken together, the counselor ID and the certification number can serve as the primary key for this table, meaning that no two records would be allowed to have the same values for counselor ID and certification number. Let's take a look at how we build that constraint. To do that, we come and use the keyword constraint. So we're creating the table here. After we've defined the columns, we then say constraint. We give that constraint a name. In this case, I'll just call it certification primary key, or PK. Then I say what kind of constraint it is, and there are 5 different kinds of constraints available in Oracle. This is the primary key constraint, and so we will say primary key. And then in parentheses, we indicate which columns make up that primary key. And so we'll say the counselor ID and the certification number. And then I'm done creating that table. We'll go ahead and execute it, and we'll see the table creates just fine. So now I'm going to insert a few records into this. And let's take a look at those records. So here I've inserted 2 certifications, a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Counseling, for counselor number 10, who is Quinn Fowler. So now let's try to add another record that would violate that primary key. So the point here so far is that we can see that I can have two counselor IDs with the same value, as long as they've got different values for their certification number. But now I'm going to try to add another record that has the same value for both. So this should conflict with this existing 10 and 2. And so when I try to insert that, Oracle says, hey, that's going to violate that primary key, and so we're not allowed to let that record go in. We have the same thing no matter where we put the null value, it's going to be rejected. So if the null goes in the first column, it's rejected. If we try to put the null in the second column, that's going to be rejected as well. But if we specify that, we'll take a look at it here, and we'll see that none of those records that violated those constraints made it into the database. But now let's go ahead and insert one that doesn't violate, and we should be able to get that next certification in. And we'll put a couple more in for our next counselor. And so we can see that we've got multiple records that have a 1 in the certification number. We have multiple records that have a 10 in the counselor ID, but there are no 2 records that are allowed to have the same values for both of those. Turns out there's a simpler way to specify this most recent version of the primary key constraint that has multiple columns. It's referred to as a composite primary key. So let's take a look at the syntax for that one. Let's go back to the way that we built that in the first place. And the very first part here, where we say constraint and then we give it a name, that's not necessary. If we skip that part, Oracle will come up with a name on its own, because it can recognize the keyword primary key and say, oh, this is a constraint. And it will create a name for us that we don't have to manage. And so that's the simplified version for making composite primary key. And it works exactly the same as the fully specified primary key. The only difference is we don't get to specify that name. That table gets created. And that's really then the 3 ways that we can specify the primary key. One is inline. I can use that when I have just a single column primary key. 2 is a fully qualified primary key constraint statement, where I give it the name, or the simplified version where I just say there'll be a primary key here and indicate the columns. And that's how we enforce the primary key constraint in Oracle.